So we're going to pick up where we left off here, talking about the general types of reproduction, asexual reproduction versus sexual reproduction. And the last thing we were talking about is asexual reproduction by binary fission in the prokaryotes. So now what we're going to talk about is how eukaryotes reproduce asexually, specifically this process of mitosis. So asexual reproduction in eukaryotes is exclusively done through this process of mitosis, okay? So if we were to look at this tree of the major domains, the eukaryotes, the archaea, and the bacteria, mitotic and meiotic division, cell division, is unique to the eukaryotes, okay? So the archaea and the bacteria, this group that represent the prokaryotes, they cannot do mitosis, they cannot do meiosis. They can only reproduce by this binary fission process. Only the eukaryotes can do mitosis and meiosis. And specifically what we're talking about now is mitosis. And this is the process that eukaryotes use, once again, for asexual reproduction. So if you think about the setup of a eukaryotic cell, they've got a cell membrane, some might have a cell wall too, they've got a nucleus, and then they've got linear chromosomes. So the DNA is linear instead of circular like we see in the prokaryotes, it's linear, okay? And because of that linear setup, it requires a specific set of processes to make copies of it. And that process, at least in the case of cell reproduction and making exact copies of the cells, is called mitosis, okay? And so mitosis is the process, once again, that eukaryotes use for asexual reproduction, where you start with a parent cell, and then it produces two daughter cells. So let's talk about this process of mitosis in a little bit more detail. Essentially, you start off with an individual parent cell. That parent cell, remember, is diploid. So it's 2n, where n is the number of chromosomes and 2 is the number of copies of each chromosome. So this cell really represents a eukaryotic cell with just one chromosome. So we'll call this chromosome number 1, and there's 2 copies of it, or 2 versions of that chromosome, a blue copy and a red copy. So the first part is this individual chromosome that there's 2 copies of. So there's 2 copies of chromosome number 1. It makes copies of each of those different versions of chromosome number 1 to make these things called sister chromatids, okay? So here's chromosome number 1, the one version of it, and the exact replica of it. And then here's chromosome number 1, the other version of it, and the exact copy of that other version of it. And these are called sister chromatids. Okay, and then what happens is basically these chromosomes that are duplicated align in the middle somewhere, and then they get pulled apart such that one copy of chromosome number 1, that red copy, and the other version of chromosome number 1, the blue copy, get pulled to one side, and then the other 2 copies get pulled to the other side, such that in these daughter cells, you're always guaranteed to get a red copy and a blue copy in both of these daughter cells, okay? And so that way, this daughter cell, or both of these daughter cells, remain diploid. They have both versions of chromosome number 1 in them. There's 2 copies of the n number of chromosomes, where n is 1 chromosome, okay? So I wouldn't expect you to remember sister chromatids and a lot of the terminology that I busted out right there, but I do want you to understand is how this process works to maintain ploidy, so that you have a parent cell that's 2n and you have daughter cells that are 2n. And there's every sort of different version of the individual chromosomes in each of these cells. So big punchlines here. The important thing to remember here is that number 1, in mitosis, daughter cells are genetically identical to the parent cells. Unless, of course, there's some mutation occurs that occurs during this process, but that's very, very rare, okay? And so these daughter cells right here have the exact same genetic makeup and exact same alleles for each individual gene on each of these chromosomes. So the daughter cells are genetically identical to each other if mitosis has done its job right, and these daughter cells are genetically identical to the parent cell if mitosis has done the job right. And the second part is that daughter cells are always going to have the same ploidy as the parent cells, unless mitosis messed up somewhere. And if you don't have the same ploidy, typically that cell's going to die, okay? So if mitosis is doing its job right, the parent cell's diploid, the daughter cells are diploid, and all this stuff is genetically identical, okay? So let's talk about mitosis and what it's good for. So why have mitosis? So number one, outside of asexual reproduction, mitosis is really important for just the growth of an individual multicellular organism, okay? So if you think about a eukaryotic multicellular organism like Walter White here, or any human being or any other multicellular organism, eukaryotes are constantly undergoing mitosis to grow in general, and also just to grow from a two-cell embryo. So remember, any human being started out as a fertilized embryo where you had an egg and a sperm come together, started out as 2 cells. Those 2 cells split into 4 cells. Those 4 cells split into 8 cells, so on and so forth, up into the trillions and trillions of cells that make up a baby, and the trillions and trillions of cells that are required for a baby to grow into an adult, okay? And so anytime those cells are reproducing and making copies of themselves, they're doing that through mitosis. And likewise, anytime that you get a scratch or a cut or a boo-boo, and you've got to heal that, you've got to create new cells, you've got to create new skin, all of that is really driven through mitosis. So you're making genetically identical copies of your cells. You're not reproducing, but your cells are making copies of themselves. So mitosis is really important for that. Now, mitosis is also really important for asexual reproduction, okay? And so we can see asexual reproduction through mitosis in unicellular eukaryotes. So remember that mitosis is unique to eukaryotes, and that when eukaryotes are asexually reproducing, they're using mitosis, okay? And so we can see unicellular eukaryotes reproducing through mitosis to make new copies of themselves. And this process is also called budding, okay? So here you can see a paramecium. This is a single cell or unicellular eukaryotic organism. This is a type of protist. Or you can see it in yeast. So yeast are a unicellular type of fungi, and remember that fungi are also eukaryotes. So this parent cell is producing a copy of itself, it's budding off a copy of itself to reproduce, or you've got this little yeast budding off a copy of itself to reproduce, okay? And so in both of these processes, these unicellular eukaryotic organisms are using mitosis to reproduce. You've also got some eukaryotes that can use or multicellular eukaryotes that can use fragmentation to reproduce. And this is another process. It's just that you have a multicellular eukaryote that's once again using mitosis to reproduce. And so with fragmentation, basically you're taking a piece of an individual multicellular organism, breaking it off, and then that will go on to produce copies of itself through mitosis. And this is what's often used for coral restoration, okay? So if there's a big spot where you want to introduce new corals and grow some corals back, you can actually break off one chunk of a parent or several chunks of a parent coral, stick it onto these sort of scaffoldings, and then these fragments will go on and grow. And so it's basically you're snapping off a little piece of that, and it'll make copies of itself that'll grow from there. And once again, these are genetically identical copies of that parent coral. Other types of asexual reproduction through mitosis, some multicellular eukaryotes can use vegetative reproduction. So vegetative reproduction is sort of similar to fragmentation, except basically you're just budding off and creating a lot of copies of yourself that are still connected to the parent, okay? So we can see this in this air plant where it's got a leaf and it's creating these little copies of itself here on the leaf. Or you've got aspen trees. And so with aspen trees, they can send out these long sort of roots, and out of those roots, second trees, third trees, fourth trees, they can make a bunch of copies of themselves that grow out of these roots. And that's called vegetative reproduction. And as a result, you've got something like the largest organism on Earth by sort of weight, and that is this pando quaking aspen. So what you're looking at here, all of this sort of trees that are sort of yellow and greenish in here, these are all separate stems, but it's one giant plant that is reproduced vegetatively. So it's made a ton of genetically identical copies of itself that are all sort of connected. And it's over 80,000 years old. It covers 107 acres, and it's estimated to weigh somewhere around 13 million pounds. Okay, so this is an example of vegetative reproduction. In other organisms, so some multicellular eukaryotes can reproduce mitotically and asexually through this process of parthenogenesis, okay? So parthenogenesis is essentially where females can produce eggs that are never actually fertilized by males, so they're never fertilized by a male sperm, but those eggs can actually divide by mitosis and eventually develop into a fully grown individual animal. And so we see this in Komodo dragons, we see this in other lizards. Bees are capable of a sort of form of this. And so if you think back, if you've seen the movie Jurassic Park and this idea that life finds a way, and the Jurassic Park, the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park, the females ended up being able to reproduce even though they didn't produce males through this process of parthenogenesis. Okay, so that's asexual reproduction in eukaryotes through the process of mitosis. So now I'd like you to answer this question. All right, if you said by random mutations that occur by mitosis, that is the correct answer, okay? So A is false by combining sex cells like eggs and sperm. That, by definition, means that the organism is reproducing sexually. It requires meiosis, so that cannot happen. As soon as you have eggs and sperm, you're no longer doing mitosis. You're doing meiosis, you're doing sex. In horizontal gene transfer, these are processes that are unique to the prokaryotes. Eukaryotic organisms cannot do horizontal gene transfer. So the only source of genetic variation in asexually reproducing eukaryotes is through random mutations that occur during mitosis. And so this is very, very important to understand because remember, you need genetic variation in a population for natural selection to have different things to select from, okay? And so if all of the population is genetically identical, you don't get any of that variation, and that population is equally susceptible to any sort of changes in the environment, okay? And so for natural selection to do its work, you've got to have variation in the population. And the only way you're going to get that variation in the population of asexually reproducing eukaryotes is through this process of mutation. So that's a very limiting factor of asexual reproduction. All right, so the last thing that I'd like you to do here is fill in this summary table for asexual reproduction, okay? So we've got the definition of asexual reproduction here. Now I'd like you to fill in these 1, 2, 3, 4 blanks, okay? So who can do asexual reproduction, prokaryotes or eukaryotes? Can you give me some examples or names of specific types of asexual reproduction that we just discussed? What process is used to replicate DNA in asexual reproduction? So binary fission, mitosis, or meiosis. And then how is genetic variation created for asexual reproduction? So go ahead and fill that in. Okay, so you should have said that both prokaryotes and eukaryotes can do asexual reproduction. In terms of examples of asexual reproduction for prokaryotes, it's binary fission. For eukaryotes, you can have budding, fragmentation, parthenogenesis, or vegetative reproduction. For asexual reproduction, prokaryotes, the process is binary fission. In eukaryotes, it's mitosis. And for how genetic variation, for prokaryotes, they produce genetic variation through mutation and horizontal gene transfer, so things like conjugation, transduction, transformation, etc. And for eukaryotes, the only way that genetic variation is created through mutation during mitosis.